A round of applause for Ian.
What's up, everybody? I'm Ian, if you don't know me. I'm a junior officer in SGDA, started 2 semesters ago, and I'm a senior graduating this semester in ATech, focusing on level design, which involves a little bit of game design and art by extension. And today I'm going to talk about art and design, a little bit of psychology, and how hopefully you can build these into the foundation of your games to create interesting and memorable and enjoyable experiences for your players. So even though we often think of design, art, and kind of moving towards the deadline and end of the project as this process where it's design, then art, and then we ship it, it's less of a timeline. It's not always going to be designing with art or with design as a foundation. A lot of times it will turn into this. It's super iterative, and while you are required to create mechanics and level blockouts to polish over later on, we still need to, let's see, oh, I should be using this. There's so many. There is going to be a lot of hopping back and forth between art and design as we progress through development. But we can help avoid this if we build in art as we think about design and vice versa. If we work in tandem, we can prevent this catastrophe. We need to balance the two and create pretty immersive visuals with clear underlying design and information. So it's easier to strike this balance and create a strong experience for our players when we balance these two and build them together early in the project. There we go. All right, so otherwise our player isn't going to understand our designs, where to go, the goals we want to create. Like I said, you want to create this clarity early and build it into the foundation. And the best way that we can do this is through contrast. And this is kind of the concept of using art in your design. Contrast is simply defined as striking difference. And you get it when you juxtapose 2 different things on top of one another. Essentially, this talk is going to be a lot of, the first half of it, rather, is going to be me showing you a lot of examples of contrast in the way that games use these in interesting ways. So hopefully you can use them similarly or in your own unique ways in your games. A lot of these are also combined strategies. So I encourage you, as I look through these photos and talk about examples, for you to dissect these photos and think about each individual aspect and how they're using contrast to guide attention and make the player look and go where they want to go. The right button this time. So color is the most fundamental tool, but it's also kind of the most complicated, so I'm not going to get super into it. But as artists and designers, you should understand color theory, complementary colors, stuff like that. You should also understand color relationships and what they represent. For example, purple might be royalty, or we'll talk about it in just a sec, yellow being the color of guidance. A great game that uses this is Gris. It's a 2D kind of Metroidvania style game, but they use color both artistically and really masterfully to guide the player and look exactly where they want you to look. Here you have this red and blue contrast with these beams of light. It's very clear. Color can also be further broken down. We have saturation, hue, and brightness. I'm not going to talk about these too much either, but these are more attributes to color that you can use to create difference and contrast to guide the player's eye. You may have seen the yellow paint debate on Twitter, X, formerly known as Twitter. Yellow in games has kind of become the color of guidance, and it's gone almost a bit too far, where it's kind of patronizing, and people get a little upset when they see it done in this way. I don't think this is inherently bad. Often people who play games don't really want to think too much. And from the C-suite perspective, that money, games are about money. This is the easiest way to open up the audience so that more people can not get stuck in your game. As designers, like I said, I don't think this is inherently bad, but you should be doing your best to create creative ways to draw the eye, because there are so many other things we can do besides bright yellow paint. For example, on a higher level of color, we have lighting. It's basically just color, but it has the preconceived notions in our head of how light works. For example, it has a source, it has warmth, it helps us navigate and see, and therefore we are drawn towards it. You can see here, this is a screenshot from Cyberpunk's Dogtown in the new DLC. And obviously the developers are guiding us directly towards this tree to maybe do a quest or check out what those other guys are looking at. So it's a great way to direct the player's attention. Shape and form are also a super great way to create visual language in your games. This is a screenshot from Silksong. I've been really enjoying this. Y'all should let me know when you beat it, what you think. But we can create shape language and use this to direct our player and create sort of subtle, unconscious behavior. For example, circles are soft and comforting, triangles are dynamic or dangerous, and squares are strong and stable. And you'll see this built into a lot of architecture in games. And the more you notice it, the more it breaks your immersion, but it is used a lot. This is a level from Titanfall 2, the Beacon. And there's really strong shape language here, but you might not notice it if you're not paying attention. They've used these cylinders high in the sky, the comforting round shape, to guide the player through the level. They've built contrast between the long fall below and the enemies that are attacking you with these cylindrical shapes that you're jumping between, and they convey safety, so they push you through the level. We can also contrast rectilinear shapes, like this tower from Firewatch, with the organic shapes of the environment surrounding it. This stands out pretty well. Firewatch is a really beautiful game. Check that out. And Rai Lucaria from Elden Ring is another example of actually combining these shapes to create contrast and to tell a story. Rai Lucaria is this strong and powerful magical school, but they study something like magic that is super dangerous and volatile, and it conveys that story through the shape language. You can see the spires that kind of convey danger. But you might also notice that the focal point here, we turn the thing on again, the focal point is the circle in the center of the painting, which is actually contrasting with everything else around. Also, the place you're supposed to go, like right there, has a rounded arch. So they're still using this contrast even as they combine the techniques. Gigantic is another example that has really strong shape language. It's not just about guiding the player through the environment, but we use these shapes to create strong characters. This is a particularly explicit example of Sven. We see round, comforting shape language used in support characters a lot in games, and that can convey emotion and behavior. When we start combining these shapes, we get silhouette, and this is another strong way to use shape. This is Fallout New Vegas. From the very onset of the game, you have this tower that you see right when you spawn, and this becomes sort of iconic as you see the silhouette on the skyline juxtaposed either on the clear sky, where you see a dark silhouette, or a dark sky where it's all lit up. And this guides you throughout the entire game in a big loop around the map. It's not just about buildings, like I said, or characters. It's about animation, 3D modeling. Building in silhouette into your characters helps create dynamicism and makes your characters and spaces interesting, even if the player doesn't consciously notice it. So you should always strive as you combine shapes to create these interesting silhouettes. Really strong posing on the enemy and character. Scale is another really strong way to guide the player. The bigger the scale, the more important it is conveyed as. This is Helldivers 2. Maybe you guys have been playing this recently. It's a very busy composition, lots of yellow, pretty monochromatic, and it's also obscured by a lot of fog. However, we know that this bug is bad just because its size. We're also understanding that it probably has a lot of health. Maybe it's a boss, and we should kill it for democracy. Shadow of the Colossus also uses massive scale. It's probably one of the strongest examples of massive scale in games. And I'm assuming, I'm fairly confident even, that if this building, despite it having a very strong silhouette, was a fourth the size or half the size, we wouldn't be nearly as attracted to go towards it. Like I said, it does have a very strong silhouette, but that scale is also emphasized by the barren landscape around it. So it's a waypoint that we want to go towards. Continuing, we have detail. Contrastive detail helps attract the eye. This is Titanfall 2. This is a super impressive set piece that we see pretty early in the game. We have all this shrapnel and explosions and everything, and it contrasts with, bland concrete floors, and we're attracted directly towards it. But we can also invert detail, and we can draw the player's attention through simplicity. This is Hi-Fi Rush. You get thrown up into the sky at the beginning of the game, pretty early on again, and you're hit with a super busy cityscape. But your eye is actually attracted to the Vandalay Tower V with a smooth gradient of color and a simple silhouette. So with detail, we are starting to get combination of color, silhouette, shape, all of those things. Again, Hi-Fi Rush uses, it's particularly a busy game, so it does use attracting the attention of the player through simplicity quite often. We're attracted kind of through the legs of the statue because of its simplicity of color, and it doesn't quite have as much detail. Thought you were gonna get away without seeing Griphook. So movement is a great way in games to attract attention. Relative to a static environment, the eye is going to be attracted towards movement. Just use birds. We use birds, but birds are super common in games. You can also flip this. Oh, yeah, I have written in the speaker notes. You should check it out. It's free on Steam. Anyways, little shameless plug. Anyways, so you can flip this as well and actually guide the player and guide the eye through a static environment or with a static path in a super busy environment. Titanfall, again, the last level of the game. Spoilers, you're running on paths above this reactor that's exploding and rocks are flying everywhere, but you have this path of metal and you can see, probably turn it on again, but we will run on those rocks at the end there. So our eye is kind of anchored in this super busy environment and our attention is drawn. We can also frame compositions to help direct the eye. This is Doom Eternal. This is the contrast of proximity. And in this case, it isn't guiding us towards that vista, but it does help it hit harder. Another great example of this is Elden Ring. All of their vistas are really well composed. The vista hits really hard because of these oppressive close walls and that contrast of proximity and darkness as we enter this grand vista. You'll also notice over by the Capitol, there's some birds over there that help draw our eye towards the end goal. This is BioShock Infinite. We don't just need to guide the eye towards where we want them to look, but we can guide them towards things because a lot of times we frame things with doorways or portals that push the player forwards. This is, I think, a major plot point. I haven't played BioShock Infinite in quite a while, but I think there's a little cutscene triggered as you enter this doorway. Convergence or converging compositions, another great way. This is Fallout 4's Diamond City. We have some stairs at the bottom. We have buildings flanking either route of the path. And we also have tons and tons of power lines up at the top that help direct the player's attention towards the center. Obviously, we're also using color and strong silhouette in the center, but it's a very converging composition. In level design, a lot of times we call this leading lines. It's kind of a meme. If you scroll through Twitter, there's like full Twitter accounts that just draw lines on photos. But this is a good example from Tim Does Level Design. He has a lot of really niche resources about specific concepts and how we can create converging compositions to guide the player exactly where we want them to go. What he does here is he actually places a little wooden cart, he places some fences to flank the path, he landscape terrains, like he terraforms the mountains in the background and creates foliage that flanks. And something you might not even notice is there actually is a little path behind between these two stumps. But that's purposeful because we want to direct the player's attention to continue towards that bridge. So, great way to get the player to go exactly where you want them to go. Strong combination of silhouette, detail, and converging is this prison in Half-Life Alyx. The wires kind of push your eye upwards. It's super, super difficult in games to make players look up. It's super hard. But this does it well because the player sees these lines wherever they are and they look up to this looming landmark in the space. Then we can combine light and leading lines and we can get God rays, which are both an artistic direction thing and a guidance thing. And it can guide the player's eye towards the source at some item or some character or to an exit in the space and where we want them to look. So a more natural way to use leading lines. A lot of developers fake this. They use planes in the environment, and they lower the opacity so you have a lot of control. continuing. No, there's a lot of these. We have perspective. Dishonored 2 does this really well. When you're viewing something from a unique perspective, your eye is naturally drawn as you kind of work out this interesting view, and so you piece what you're looking at because it's unusual. It adds visual interest, and you have to process that information. Obviously, we're looking down at some people here. Normally, we'd be looking at eye level. You're always in the rooftops or in the rafters of buildings in Dishonored, so that's a great example. But we can show views of entire levels that we're about to explore from interesting perspectives. Hades has a full level view. Obviously, it's not the actual level you're navigating, it's just a piece of art to represent it. But this isometric top-down view of levels that we'd normally be in the rooms of helps add visual interest and engage the player. Elden Ring again. Here, I think we're in the top of the Eternal City, and we look down on all these interesting buildings with rooftops that we'd normally be seeing from eye level or far below. This is a really interesting perspective that helps us guide the eye. One of the few non-game examples is from this YouTube video by Stephen Travers' art. Super, super up close as we look up at a composition, adds a lot of visual interest and makes the player interested in what they're seeing. Horror games may use continuity or the idea of a continuing space. This is essentially the idea of paths, but in horror games like Outlast, they use a trail of blood that implies that a space continues. Perhaps as you enter this space, that doorway is blocked by the wall there, and so the player doesn't see where to go. And so they've used this to guide you into that direction. It also builds tension really well, so it helps support the game that they're trying to make, which is good. The reason I did this talk was actually because of this really cool gameplay trailer by the Ori developers. It's called No Rest for the Wicked, and it's a Souls-like style game, but it's isometric, and it's so pretty. And I was looking at this trailer, and I was like, they use so many strategies really well. You see they have this big focal point of this bonfire, all these paths in different directions. They have rim lighting on this cart to help you see the path up to the top of the castle. But what they do here with these birds is they're using motion, but they're having that motion continue into a different space towards the door you need to enter to progress. And it's that idea of implying a larger space to help you move forwards. So using motion to imply a larger space here. Two more here. We have affordance. If the player thinks that they can understand how something works, they are probably going to be drawn towards it. Affordance is the concept of form implying a function, essentially. So a door affords being opened. This is a big concept in level design. You'll hear a lot of stuff about this. But in horror games, for example, like we think we can open a door, so we go towards it. If the door is very clearly locked or doesn't even have a handle, maybe we won't go towards it. So you can draw the player with affordance and their understanding of how to use an object. Water fountains, for example, in a less immersive, realistic game, not a horror game, like Fallout 3, we have water fountains that don't have strong silhouette or lighting or color or movement or anything, but because we know how water fountains work in real life, we're potentially drawn towards them and we interact with them. And we get 30 HP and 3 radiation from that. And then finally, we have familiarity. As you start to build a visual language with the player, you start to have them recognize things. The speaker notes shrunk again. No. Oh well. Once they become familiar with a mechanic, essentially, they're going to be, at least, if they're not drawn towards it, they're going to understand how it works and they're going to know how to use it. So if they recognize these little paths from Celeste, you'll know that if you enter it, you come out directly on the other side and it maintains your momentum. And it's going to draw your attention and guide you in the direction you're supposed to go. Kind of like how games maybe use enemies, and when you see an enemy, you're like, oh, I'm on the right path. So you can use mechanics and familiarity that you build to guide the player. But this is a great way to segue into psychology with a short review that I added. Here's some Minecraft parkour if you're starting to zone out. Do any of you have any interesting games that you think use light or shape, color, form, any of these to attract attention?
Monument Valley.
Monument Valley, okay. How so?
A lot of the levels are designed on perspective, where in each level, in order to create a path, you have to swipe the screen until the geometry creates a path in that perspective.
Okay, yeah, so definitely using perspective to create interest there. That's awesome. I remember playing Monument Valley. But now that we know how to guide the player and make them look where we want to look and go where we want to go, we can kind of manipulate their behavior. I've been here gaslight the player, but that's maybe not. We want to control and condition their behavior so that they can have the experience we intend and enjoy our game. And one of the ways that we do this is through conditioning. So not to go 2301 with Dr. Atkinson on you, but basically there's two kinds of conditioning. We have classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So classical conditioning is something we care about a little less, but it's the idea of associating something, a neutral stimulus with an involuntary behavior. In this example, we have Pavlov's dog, which you might have heard about. Essentially, he blows a whistle or has a beep, and the dog salivates because he thinks he's going to get food. And that's an involuntary behavior of hunger and salivating. And then on operant conditioning is associating a voluntary behavior with a consequence. So in this case, it's the Skinner rat. And this is a rat that is put in a cage and presses a button anytime he wants food. And so they're both revolving around wanting food and being hungry, but in the operant conditioning case, it's actually a behavior that you can control. So we're less talking about meta-level progression systems and rewards, like battle passes and mounts in games. I'm talking about more in conditioning in terms of gameplay, teaching mechanics, teaching a player how to navigate the space, conditioning them to understand the visual language you're trying to create. So there's a couple points that you should remember as you condition your player and teach them about the game you're creating. The first one is provide immediate feedback. When you're teaching the player how to jump, if you have them press the button and then it jumps 30 seconds later, they're never going to make that connection between pressing that jump button and the action happening. They're never going to be conditioned to do that. Similarly, if you don't repeat the process, they are never going to understand what that button does because you've only had them do it once. They have to make that connection by repeating the action. And then finally, working simple to complex. You can't have a player jump over spikes, double jump on moving platforms without teaching them how to jump up a ledge first. So you have to slowly increment that behavior towards what you want. In terms of operant conditioning, we also have positive reinforcement, which is a positive reward for doing something right. Then we have negative reinforcement, which is a little more niche, and that's removing something bad when we do something right. And then we have punishment, and that's when you die in games, I guess. One of the most common examples, like I said, is teaching controls. The very, very first action in the first Mario game does this really, really well. So if you jump, you get a reward. You hit your head on the puzzle box, and you get a coin. If you jump, you also land on the little goober, and the goober dies, and he's removed. So you have removed this negative consequence. And if you don't do anything at all, you're punished because you die. Mario does this really well with all three in the very first action, but also some other games do this. I think some of the best games, or at least the most noticeable ones, are horror games and immersive games. And we have some examples of this. Hopefully there's sound. Outlast does this really well. Essentially, they introduce an evil antagonist pretty early in the game with the sound of chains. And because they force you to run and hide based on the sound of this chain, they're not only using voluntary behavior with a consequence of being attacked by this guy. There we go, I can play the video again. They're not only instilling this behavior of running away and hiding when you hear these chains, but they're also classically conditioning you because they instill this sense of fear in you. You may not even notice it's happening, but you're sweating and you're tense. And here, there's chains every time he walks around. This guy comes back like 3 or 4 times throughout the game. And every time you hear those sound of chains, you kind of get tense and you may not even realize it. Positive reinforcement, on the other hand, may be more familiar if people have played Hollow Knight. They use sound with cornifers like humming and whistling throughout the map to attract your attention. He has this cute little hum, and you hear it when you're nearby in the map. It conditions you to move towards his location which progresses you through the game, and when you reach him, you get a map of the area. So anytime you hear it, you go towards it. And it's a little happy. It's not Outlast. Okay, back to horror games. So another way we can use conditioning to create interesting gameplay, based on prior conditioning, this is Amnesia, The Dark Descent. You can see they've guided you into this nice, comforting, safe room here. And then when you enter this room, it's got round shape language and whatever, you're all comfy. The lights go out and there's loud noises and you get really uncomfy because there's lots of sounds that you can't hear. We're not strongly conditioning a new behavior here. Can I play it again while I talk? Yeah. We're not strongly conditioning a new behavior here, but we are relying on the player's preconceived notions and previously conditioned behaviors and their understandings of light and safety. There's this round room, they're conditioned to think that's safe. And you've got warm lights, it guides you. And then it's blown out, the lights go out, and you now associate lighting still with safety, but you're a little tense when you see it. So that's an interesting way that they've used this to guide the player, but also subvert ideas. Speaking of subverting ideas, this is not out yet, but this is Elden Ring's newly announced DLC. There's a lot of Souls games in this presentation. This guy, he has pretty round shape language, these nice warm colors. I guarantee if you get near him, he gives you a terminal illness or explodes. So this is an interesting way that you can subvert preconceived notions, again, and teach the player a visual language that's unique. It's up to you to create this visual language in your games and teach the player in these interesting ways. We can also shape the player. Back to that Skinner rat that I mentioned with operant conditioning, you're not going to be able to shape the player instantly. With the rat, you place a treat on that side of the cage, and then you place a treat on the button, and then you place a treat when he presses the button once, and then he starts to press the button. You can't teach it instantly. So in in Edge Runners, or what is, I can never remember it.
Ghost Runner.
Ghost Runner. Yeah, I can never remember the name of this game. Yeah, but there's too many cyberpunk things. There's too much cyberpunk media. But yeah, so in Ghost Runner, there's a lot of complex things that they teach you. They teach you how to attack while you're wall running and deflect projectiles. But they couldn't do that if they don't teach you early how to jump and slide and do basic actions. And the important thing here is you still have to reward the player for those actions early on, no matter how simple they are. Oftentimes, the reward is the gameplay itself, so it's a little paradoxical, but you should be rewarding the player regardless of the complexity of their actions. Otherwise, they're not going to be interested in learning further. And then we have avoidance learning. So this is the concept of players actually preemptively doing a behavior to avoid negative reinforcement. Maybe you've played stealth or horror games like Alien Isolation, where you've been conditioned to crouch all the time even when there's no enemy nearby. This is avoidance learning. You're now doing that behavior preemptively to avoid the consequence. And it's not exactly something we can control, but we can subvert it. So Five Nights at Freddy's, for example, this is Five Nights at Freddy's 2. They give you a mask to put on. And for me personally, I put this mask on expecting it to, like what they said, avoid the animatronics. But if you leave it on, you get jump scared with absolutely no warning. So it's a great way of maybe the player having this avoidance learning and subverting it and scaring you more. And then finally, for conditioning, we have learned helplessness. This is another concept that maybe we should avoid as we balance difficulty in our games. If the player experiences something negatively repeatedly, they're going to learn helplessness. If an opportunity to surpass that solution or to solve something presents itself, if they have learned helplessness, they're not going to take that chance. You should be careful when you balance games, difficulty and mechanics-wise, to avoid this concept. I think Minecraft actually does it well because one of their core tenets is anything bad that happens to the player is the player's fault. Creepers are probably the most extreme example, but you could still say they didn't close their doors or light the house or whatever. So be careful to balance mechanics and difficulty so the player doesn't quit your game and go play an easier one. Yeah. Recap. Players learn through conditioning. There's 2 different kinds of conditioning and a couple different kinds of consequences. You've got to shape that behavior slowly, and you should be careful about avoidance learning and learned helplessness. Does anyone have any games that they feel, it's a little more complicated than the last one, that condition them in an interesting way?
Mutation? It's a cyberpunk game.
So conditioning also heavily relates to memory. We all want to make memorable games. We want to help the player encode or gather the information that we give them and store it and then retrieve it later on. And that kind of enables them to learn. There's a number of things that we can do to influence memory and help the player store and recall that we should use as designers. But there's also some things we can't control that we should be aware of. So knowledge base is something that heavily influences memory. It can relate to what you've already taught players when you've conditioned them, but it can also relate to other games or past experiences. So for example, Call of Duty, maybe industry norms like yellow paint or specific knowledge about real life. They've done studies where if they ask a chess player, a master versus someone who's never played before, to remember the location of pieces, the person who knows chess really well remembers all the piece locations. So knowledge base affects memory. So maybe you played Call of Duty as a child. Your parents were bad for letting you play them. But you remember all the weapons and the names of the weapons and the map layouts because you had this knowledge ingrained in you so early. And you have this knowledge base. We can use this knowledge base when we construct spaces to help orient the player and help them navigate. So essentially, there are preconceived notions and certain implications about certain spaces. We have grocery stores or churches or even like an under construction bowling alley. All of those have implications about how the space is constructed. And because the player comes in with that knowledge, we can guide them through the space. This is Half-Life, and we have a prison. We have understandings that there's going to be somewhere where the officers hang out. There's going to be a second floor, and there's going to be large cell blocks with small rooms. And then potentially we could even subvert that with ways prisoners have burrowed through the walls to escape. But we can use this to help orient and guide the player. We can also create memories with emotion. Perhaps you can recall a moment that you were super happy or super embarrassed, and this kind of cements that time in your life, in your memories. A great example of this, for me personally, is when I am playing an open world game and I enter this sprawling vista, for example, in Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom. You enter this sprawling vista and you're hit with this wonder and awe, and you're super excited about the experience you're about to have exploring, and that cements the location in your memory. Or perhaps, rather than cementing a location, we cement a mechanic, an understanding potentially of those waves on the ground. It's a super frustrating boss fight, but you have this rush of dopamine after, and we can use that emotion to create a memory in the player's head and help them understand a mechanic. We're using emotion to help teach the player here. Memory also is heavily context dependent. For me personally, this space in Alien Isolation, they make you backtrack through it multiple times. It's super difficult. There's an alien in there that walks around and you have to stealth. And it's one of the first early super difficult points in the game, at least for me. And so we can use the context and the environment that something happens to cement something in the player's memory. Perhaps you can have the player fight in one boss room and then have a second boss fight later on that brings that back. Or make them walk through an environment that makes them super scared because something happened there earlier. There's an idea called associative learning, and it's associating two elements to cement them in your memory. Connection is something that helps people remember. It's our job as designers to help people make these connections, and a great example of this is map design that has hubs or central locations that we can re-enter, and they can create connections in our brain of how they are made. Okay, I don't have the slide that I made. That's fine. We can help the player create these connections by making really big landmarks in our space. In Halo Infinite, we have this giant, strong silhouette, sci-fi with bright lights in a pretty organic environment. And that's going to be visible as we play through this map, and it's going to help us remember where we are in the space and use it to orient ourselves. A game like The Finals, maybe you've played this recently as well, super complex maps with lots of interiors and exteriors, and everything's fully destructible, so it can be super overwhelming. But thanks to good map design, like this strong silhouette building, I think this is Monaco, but having this to orient yourself in the map helps players understand where they are, and it's memorable for the player. It's also asymmetrical, so looking at it from the front and the sides helps the player understand where they are, and they can remember its layout. One way that we can help the player perhaps overcome puzzles is the concept of priming, or subliminal perception. The player is going to pick things up without even realizing it subconsciously. Essentially, we can show the player an example of something, and then later we can ask them to solve a puzzle, and they'll think they did it themselves, but really we helped them do it because we primed them. They did experiments where they showed people a rabbit, and then a couple hours later they asked them to spell the word hare, and everyone spelled it H-A-R-E. So that's kind of the concept here. So a lot of times this is done in puzzle design. For example, in the Water Temple in the Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, they have this strong imagery of lots of water falling and anti-gravity, and as the player progresses, it kind of primes the player for the solution to these puzzles, which is riding water bubbles upwards, or things like that. We tried to use this in our last Game Lab game, Death Bloom. Essentially, it's a puzzle game where the player has to fill a bucket with acid to melt a lock on the door, and you can see that lock over there. But we've placed buckets by the door to help prime the player that that is the solution. Further in the level, we also have acid dripping and melting things away. So the goal there is to help the player subconsciously understand the solution to a puzzle without really telling them. We also have the serial position effect. Interesting. So we have the serial position effect, which is essentially the concept that the first and last things, primacy or recency effects, or what they're called, are going to be more memorable for the player. So potentially, if you want the player to remember a solution to a puzzle or remember something better, you want to do it more recently or at the beginning. Maybe if you clue the player into the solution to something, you should do it right away or at the very end, right before you ask for that solution. We can also use categorization, which is the idea of grouping concepts to help the player remember things and understand the spaces and mechanics we create. World of Warcraft, they have tons and tons of areas, but there's a lot of different ways that they group these areas. They have different thematics and visuals. They have different full land masses and different alliances and factions that are on each of these places. And maybe any of these can help you remember the spaces where you are. Someone says, oh, there's Elwyn Forest, and you think where it is. Fortnite, tons and tons of weapon categories, but we can categorize these to help the player understand based on preconceived notions. Snipers are long range, high damage. Shotgun is short range, high damage. The player groups these. There's nothing to say you can't create your own categories, but these help us understand and remember what weapons do and how to use them. Even a weird biomechanical game, if you played Scorn, it still has kind of weapon categories. It has a shotgun and it has a weird melee gun, like a boxing glove on the end of a stick. We can create new things, and we should create new things in categories, but you should use categories to help the player understand your mechanics. Cool, done with memory. All right, almost there. So learning requires memory. We can encode information, store it. We can elaborate on it by applying it to ourselves and to our environments, and then we can retrieve it. Vampire Survivor's gift for your attention span there. We have a knowledge base that affects our memories, and we also can we can create memories with emotion, environments, and we can prime the player to help remember things. So does anyone have good examples of games that are super memorable to them or games that use memory well?
So there's a game called BA11 Hollow.
Let's move on to the last topic that I have here, which is player choice. Choice is another difficult and complex subject in psychology. There are 4 things that the player needs to have in order to make choice possible, according to Steve Lee. Steve Lee worked on some of the Dishonored games, and I believe that his name links you to the video, but it also links you to his channel, so you can check him out later. But the 4 things are agency, or the ability to make those decisions, motivation, so an understanding of why you're doing it, information about those choices and their consequences, and then just time to process the consequences and all that information you're giving them. Steve Lee worked on Dishonored, so he might be talking about these in a big story-relevant context. But this is important for all games when you give the player choice. And Sims. So we always want choice. We want the choice to create the character we want, or create the stat build with the weapons that we want, or we want to be in a non-linear game with branching pathing, because we want all the freedom, otherwise we're going to get bored. But a lot of times choice is not the best thing. It can actually be really, really bad for a couple reasons. I don't know about anyone else, but I get super, super burnt out on RPGs because the quest log starts to look like this, and there's too much choice. And for me, that's the idea of choice fatigue, decision fatigue, actually. And it can cause indecision, it can cause making a poor decision because we don't have all the information and can't possibly process it. Maybe we just run through the experience and don't pay attention to anything because we're so burnt out. Like I said, when this happens in RPGs, I get overwhelmed and I just turn them off because I can't handle that. So it's really important that we balance the amount of choice for the game we're making. One game that I think gets choice really, really well is Killer Queen. Maybe some of you played this at the Free Play Arcade for last week, yeah, our fundraiser. It was a lot of fun, but Killer Queen does choice really well. There are 3 ways to win. Use the pointer again. You can get these little snails into the goalposts. You can kill the queen, which is down there, and they have 3 lives. Or you can get all these little berries into the little holes down there. And so what they've done is they've balanced the game type with the amount of choice really well here. If there were 5 choices or 1, it might be too competitive or super tedious or confusing. So it's your job to balance the amount of choice in the game to make an interesting and understandable experience. You should also be providing agency and time for the player to make these decisions, and they should understand the decisions that they're making. Killer Queen has little tutorial prompts that pop up early on. But you can also twist this, and you can remove one of those 4 points that we talked about: agency, motivation, time, and information. And you can create interesting experiences. So even though this game kind of is time-based, it's time-based because it's competitive. The player understands that they have to do something before the enemy team, and that time and that lack thereof creates pressure and makes the game more interesting. Lies of P has binary choice pretty often in the game. For example, here you're entering a hotel, and they tell you right before you enter the hotel that you have 2 choices, puppet or human, and the hotel doesn't let in puppets. And so you have to choose based on limited information, and you have like 10 seconds. And so they don't give you much time, and they give you even less information, but that's twisted and done to support the game and create this vague sense of wanting to learn more. So as a designer, you should be figuring out how to deliver that choice, the amount of choice that you can provide without overwhelming the player, and you should make sure you do it in a way that lets the player make an informed decision about the rest of your game. So very short section here, but we need these 4 things to make choice, and we should balance it, otherwise we will become fatigued. And we can also twist these 4 things to create interesting gameplay. So as we conclude, does anyone have interesting examples of choice in games that are memorable to them?
Once again with Ana Mutation.
Well, I hope that going forwards, when you design your own games, you can remember the concepts of conditioning and memory and choice and how to drive the player's attention and make them go where you want to go to create interesting experiences and to create new experiences. Yeah, thank you.